It was the late summer of 1940, and the air across the United States carried a strange tension and uneasy mix of pride, fear, and denial. On radios across small towns and crowded cities alike, Americans listened to the grim news from Europe: Poland crushed, France fallen, Britain standing alone against Hitler's Germany. But across the Atlantic, in the heart of America, life was still calm. People were more worried about jobs, baseball scores, and Hollywood movies than the thunder of war that echoed overseas. Most believed that the Atlantic Ocean was their shield. Let Europe fight its own battles, many said. The scars of World War I had not yet healed, and Americans had promised themselves never to be dragged into another European bloodbath. Yet, deep inside the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew that the storm was coming sooner or later. He had been watching the rise of fascism with growing alarm. Hitler's armies were advancing with terrifying speed, and Japan was growing bolder in Asia. Roosevelt knew that if Britain fell, America might stand alone as the last great democracy. The question was not if the war would reach American shores, but when. But there was one problem: America was not ready. Its army ranked only 18th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. The country had barely 200,000 active soldiers, most of them undertrained, poorly equipped, and scattered across distant bases. There was no sense of urgency among the public, and Congress was still clinging to its isolationist dream. Yet Roosevelt, a master of gradual persuasion, began to prepare the nation quietly, step by step, without openly declaring war. In June 1940, as France collapsed under Nazi tanks, Roosevelt took his first major step. He called for a program of limited national defense and hinted that every American man might one day need to serve. Many in Congress hesitated. They feared that conscription, compulsory military service, would be deeply unpopular. After all, the United States had never drafted men during peacetime in its entire history. Drafts had always come after war began, not before. To propose one now, while the country was officially at peace, seemed almost un-American. Still, Roosevelt pushed forward. He believed that training men before war was the only way to avoid chaos later. Behind closed doors, he worked with a few key allies in Congress, including Senator Edward R. Burke of Nebraska and Representative James Wadsworth of New York. They drafted a bill that would require all men between the ages of 21 and 35 to register for 1 year of military training. It would be called the Selective Training and Service Act, a name chosen carefully to sound fair and democratic. The idea was not to create a huge standing army, but to train citizens so they could defend their country if the time came. The proposal sparked fierce debate. Across the country, newspapers exploded with headlines: America's first peacetime draft proposed. Public opinion was divided. Many Americans, remembering the horrors of the First World War, were furious. "No more foreign wars" became the slogan of isolationist groups like the America First Committee, which counted celebrities such as Charles Lindbergh among its members. They accused Roosevelt of trying to drag the nation into Europe's conflict. On the other side, there were voices of warning: politicians, generals, and ordinary citizens who believed that ignoring the global threat would be a deadly mistake. In town halls and on radio shows, the arguments grew heated. Was it patriotic to prepare for war, or was it patriotic to stay out of it? Could America stay safe by standing aside, or would unpreparedness invite disaster? As the debates raged, young men nervously wondered what would happen if the bill passed. Some were excited by the prospect of serving, others dreaded being torn from their families and farms. Mothers and wives wrote letters to Congress, pleading to keep their sons at home. On September 14, 1940, after months of debate and revisions, Congress finally voted. The bill passed by a narrow margin. 2 days later, on September 16, President Roosevelt signed it into law, making history. For the first time ever, the United States would draft its citizens into military service while still at peace. Across the country, headlines screamed, "Draft becomes law, men 21 to 35 must register." Asterisk. The following month, the draft registration began. Lines formed outside schools, post offices, and courthouses as men filled out simple one-page cards with trembling hands. The process was quiet, orderly, and surprisingly calm. Many young men joked about it, treating it like a civic duty rather than a death sentence. In small towns, registration day felt almost like a festival. Flags flew, bands played, and local newspapers ran photos of proud fathers standing beside their sons. Yet beneath the patriotic smiles, there was unease. Nobody truly knew what was coming. Roosevelt addressed the nation over the radio, his calm voice reassuring millions of listeners, "We are arming for defense, not for aggression. The best way to keep out of war is to be prepared for it." His words struck a careful balance between caution and courage. He knew the American people were not ready to fight another world war, but they might be ready to defend their homes, if pushed. By the end of 1940, more than 16 million men had registered under the Selective Training and Service Act. Training camps sprang up across the country: Fort Benning, Fort Bragg, Fort Knox, where civilians became soldiers in a matter of weeks. They learned to march, shoot, and survive in the field. At first, the Army lacked equipment. Some men trained with wooden rifles or trucks made of cardboard. But the spirit of readiness began to grow. For the first time in decades, America was awakening to the reality that its freedom could no longer be taken for granted. Still, the country remained at peace. Many believed the draft was just a precaution, a temporary measure. Even the one-year service term suggested that the government didn't expect a real war anytime soon. But in the shadows of Washington, military planners knew better. Across the oceans, Hitler and Japan were preparing their next moves. And though the American people didn't yet realize it, the draft they had just accepted would soon pull them into the most devastating conflict in human history. For now, the United States stood on the edge, neither at war nor truly at peace. Families tried to live normally, pretending that the world was still safe. Young men joked about training camps, politicians promised peace, and newspapers printed reassuring headlines. But beneath the calm surface, the gears of history were already turning. The Selective Training and Service Act was more than just a law, it was the first drumbeat of America's march toward World War II. Training an army of citizens. The ink on the Selective Training and Service Act was barely dry when America began to change. From quiet towns to industrial cities, a wave of anticipation rolled across the nation. For the first time in American history, young men who had never thought of themselves as soldiers were about to become part of a great national experiment. This was not just the creation of an army, it was the transformation of an entire society. In October 1940, the first draft lottery was held in Washington, D.C. A glass bowl filled with 9,000 capsules, each containing a number, sat on a small wooden table under the glare of television lights. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, a man in his 70s with solemn eyes, reached in and drew the first capsule. The number 158 echoed through the room and across the country. That number belonged to a 21-year-old man named Frank W. Ginther from Pennsylvania, the first American citizen ever drafted in peacetime. His name appeared in every newspaper the next day. Across America, men checked their registration cards, wondering if fate had chosen them too. Those first few months after the draft began were filled with uncertainty. Thousands of local draft boards made up of ordinary citizens reviewed files and made decisions on who would serve and who would stay home. Some men volunteered before their numbers were called, believing it was their patriotic duty. Others searched for deferments, citing family responsibilities or essential jobs. The system was not perfect, but it worked. Slowly, the great machine of American mobilization began to turn. By early 1941, bus and train stations were crowded with young men carrying duffel bags, saying goodbye to tearful families. They came from farms, factories, and colleges from every corner of the nation. Most had never traveled beyond their own state, and now they were being sent hundreds of miles away to vast military training camps. These camps were hastily built rows of wooden barracks, muddy roads, and mess halls that smelled of coffee and sweat. The men slept on thin mattresses and woke at dawn to the blare of bugles. The first weeks were a shock. Civilians had to learn discipline, order, and endurance. Drill sergeants, often veterans of the last war, were rough but fair. They barked commands, teaching recruits to march in perfect rhythm, to handle rifles, and to obey instantly. Mistakes were punished with extra laps or push-ups in the dirt. Yet, over time, the chaos began to turn into coordination. The men learned teamwork, leadership, and pride. They sang marching songs under the hot sun, joked about the food, and wrote letters home describing their adventures. Slowly, they began to think of themselves not as individuals, but as soldiers of a shared purpose. Life in the camps was hard but full of energy. Training schedules were relentless: physical drills, weapon practice, tactical exercises, and night marches. Soldiers learned to dig foxholes, to camouflage, to cook rations, to repair vehicles, and to follow orders under pressure. There were no luxuries, but there was camaraderie. Bonds formed between men from completely different worlds. A farmer from Iowa might share a bunk with a factory worker from New York or a student from California. They learned each other's accents, shared cigarettes, and traded stories about home. The army was becoming a mirror of America itself: diverse, restless, and determined. Outside the camps, the nation was changing too. Industries that had been quiet during the Depression roared back to life. The War Department ordered thousands of trucks, tanks, and uniforms. Automobile plants converted their assembly lines to produce military vehicles. The economy surged, pulling the country out of the last shadows of the Great Depression. Women began taking jobs in factories, and newspapers ran patriotic slogans like "Defense Jobs Build America." There was still no war, but it felt as if the whole nation was preparing for one. Politically, Roosevelt walked a tightrope. He had to convince Americans that training and arming were acts of defense, not aggression. "We do not seek war," he told the public in his fireside chats, "but we will not shrink from our duty if war is thrust upon us." The president's calm confidence kept most Americans steady, but isolationists continued to protest. Groups like America First held rallies, claiming the draft was the first step toward another senseless war. But as the months passed, news from Europe grew darker: London under bombardment, Greece invaded, and Hitler's power expanding. Gradually, resistance to the draft began to fade. Within the camps, morale fluctuated. Some recruits were proud, others homesick. The one-year service term created tension. Men wondered what would happen when their time was up. Would they be sent home, or forced to stay longer? The answer came in August 1941, when Congress narrowly voted to extend service beyond 1 year. The margin was just one vote, but it changed everything. Now, the soldiers realized they might be in uniform for a long time. Complaints rose, but discipline held. By late 1941, more than 1 million men were under training. The U.S. Army, once small and unprepared, was slowly becoming a formidable force. New divisions were formed, new weapons tested, and military bases expanded. Maneuvers were held across vast fields of Louisiana and the Carolinas, mock battles involving tanks, airplanes, and thousands of troops. Generals like George C. Marshall and Dwight D. Eisenhower used these exercises to identify leaders for the future. What began as an experiment in peacetime defense was turning into the foundation of a global army. Yet, in everyday America, there was still disbelief that real war could reach them. Newspapers followed the war abroad, but the average citizen still hoped to stay out of it. Many soldiers joked that they were Roosevelt's tree army, destined to spend a year digging trenches in their own country. Few imagined that, within months, they would be fighting across oceans. Then came the quiet before the storm. In late November 1941, as recruits drilled in the cold mornings and wrote letters home, world events were racing toward a breaking point. Japan's ambitions in the Pacific were growing dangerous, but Washington still hoped for diplomacy. Roosevelt continued to promise peace, even as he secretly prepared for the worst. The men in uniform kept training, unaware that history was about to change everything. On the morning of December 7, 1941, as sunlight rose over Pearl Harbor, the unthinkable happened. Japanese aircraft screamed down from the sky, bombs exploding across the harbor, ships burning, and soldiers running for cover. The attack killed more than 2,000 Americans and shocked the nation into unity. That night, Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. The next day, Congress declared war on Japan, and soon after, on Germany and Italy. The United States was now fully at war. For the men who had been drafted in 1940 and 1941, everything changed overnight. What had begun as training for defense became a call to fight across continents. Many of the same men who had nervously stood in registration lines were now boarding ships bound for Europe and the Pacific. The Selective Training and Service Act had done more than prepare them. It had created the backbone of the army that would fight and win the Second World War. As 1941 ended, the calm that had once defined America was gone. The nation had transformed itself in barely a year from uncertain neutrality to total mobilization. Families sent their sons to war, factories ran day and night, and flags flew from every home. The experiment of the peacetime draft had become the engine of a wartime revolution. The United States had awakened, armed, and now, it was ready to march. The army of a nation. By 1942, the sound of marching boots echoed from every corner of the United States. What had begun as a cautious peacetime draft had become the foundation of the largest military force America had ever built. The attack on Pearl Harbor had ended all debate. The country was now fully committed to war, and the Selective Training and Service Act became the beating heart of mobilization. The draft was no longer a preparation, it was survival. In the first months after the declaration of war, the draft expanded at a staggering pace. The age range widened to include men from 18 to 45, and deferments grew stricter. Millions more registered, standing in long lines outside schools and post offices. Some volunteered before their numbers were called, unwilling to wait for fate. By 1943, almost every family in America had someone in uniform: a son, a brother, a husband. The draft, once controversial, was now accepted as a necessary duty. It was the bridge between ordinary life and the extraordinary demands of global war. As the newly drafted men poured into camps, the scale of the military effort exploded. Barracks stretched for miles across open plains, rifle ranges thundered from dawn till dusk. The United States Army, once modest and untested, grew into a giant of over 8 million men. Every few weeks, another wave of soldiers shipped out, first to North Africa, then to Europe, the Pacific, and the islands that dotted the vast ocean. The war that had seemed distant now consumed everything. For those who served, the transition from civilian to soldier was both jarring and transformative. The draft pulled together Americans from every background: farmers from Kansas, steel workers from Pittsburgh, miners from Kentucky, and clerks from Chicago. They wore the same uniforms, ate the same food, and followed the same orders. The war erased old divisions. The son of a banker might sleep beside a sharecropper, a college student might march alongside a mechanic. In that melting pot of the armed forces, a new sense of equality began to grow. Overseas, the reality of war was far from the patriotic posters that lined American streets. The men trained under the draft system found themselves in brutal battles across continents. In North Africa, they fought in blistering heat and sandstorms. In Italy, they climbed through mud and snow. In the Pacific, they faced jungles, disease, and a relentless enemy. For many of these young men, war was their first glimpse of the world beyond home, and it was a world filled with fear, exhaustion, and courage. Letters became lifelines. Soldiers wrote home whenever they could, describing not just the fighting, but their longing for normal life: the smell of their mother's cooking, the laughter of friends, the sound of rain on the roof. On the home front, families waited for news, scanning newspapers and listening to radio bulletins, hoping for a letter, dreading a telegram. Every gold star in a window told the silent story of a life lost far away. Back in America, the draft reshaped the country in other ways. With millions of men gone, women filled the empty spaces in factories, shipyards, and offices. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of strength and independence. African Americans, long excluded from equal opportunity, began pushing for a double victory against fascism abroad and racism at home. The draft brought social change that went far beyond the battlefield. For the first time, the idea of shared national duty began to break down old barriers of class and race. The government expanded its control over the economy to meet wartime needs. Factories produced planes, tanks, and weapons at astonishing speed. The draft ensured that soldiers were always ready to use them. For every man who went overseas, another stayed home to build what he would need. It was a massive, coordinated effort, an entire nation working as one machine. But even in the midst of unity, there were conflicts. Many questioned the fairness of deferments and exemptions. College students, scientists, and some industrial workers were allowed to stay, fueling debates about who truly bore the burden of war. Japanese Americans, despite being U.S. citizens, faced internment and suspicion, yet some volunteered to prove their loyalty, forming decorated units like the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The draft system reflected both America's progress and its contradictions. For the soldiers, the passage of time blurred together in a haze of battle and brotherhood. Some fought for years without returning home. They watched friends fall, survived near misses, and endured the endless grind of military life. Yet, through it all, they carried a growing sense of purpose. They knew they were fighting for something larger than themselves, not just the defeat